Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank you for attending our webinar today. Today we have Dr. Neil Websdale and Dr. Kathleen Ferraro presenting for the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. This presentation is called Collaborative Interviews for Informing Fatality Reviews. This webinar will be recorded. It will be distributed next week with closed captioning. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat pod in the lower right corner, or you can contact me at chaira@nau.edu. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat pod on the right corner. Thank you again, and we shall begin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today and for putting in where you're from. It's interesting. We have people from all over the country joining today, different time zones. So welcome. And this presentation is part of our project funded by the U.S. Office on Violence Against Women. We appreciate their ongoing support. So what we want to talk about today is ways to make our fatality reviews more in-depth and more reflective of the lives of the people we're investigating as a result of homicide. And we're going to talk about collateral interviews and define what we mean by that and why we think they're so important for really good fatality review work. We'll talk a little bit about the kinds of interviews you might want to engage in and how to prepare for them and how to conduct them, and then what to do with the information that you acquire from conducting these interviews. And you can type your questions in, as Ray said, and we'll make an effort to try to respond to all of them. But if we are unable to get to your question during the course of the webinar, our contact information is at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to email us directly with any questions we can't get to during the course of this webinar. So what we mean by collateral interviews are interviews with people who are familiar with the victim and or the perpetrator of a homicide, who can shed light on the lives prior to the fatality or the near death, including the perpetrators and survivors in near-death reviews. And we know that a lot of states now allow fatality review teams to review near deaths as well, so we'll be talking about those in some depth as well. So why do we do collateral interviews? And I know for teams that review a lot of cases and primarily gather statistical data, that this might seem like an extra level of work or something that you might not have time to do. In such cases, we do think it's a good idea to do more in-depth reviews with at least some of the cases that you're reviewing, and collateral interviews would be one component of those more in-depth interviews. What we want to do with a fatality review is not only find out how many priors the perpetrator had or how often the police responded. We want to understand what the lived experience was of the deceased person. What were they dealing with? What led up to the tragedy that took their life? And we want to offer family members a way to be part of the review. We've heard so many times, both in this country and the UK, how important it is for family members to participate in fatality review. Collateral interviews allow you to collect information that's absent from the documentary record. The police reports, prosecutors' reports, pre-sentence reports, court transcripts are all very valuable sources of information for reviews, but a lot of the details about the meaning of people's lives are going to be absent from those documents. We also can incorporate different perspectives, those that fall outside the criminal justice system, those voices who are not recorded in the history of a person's life. And the team recommendations can be enriched by tapping into these sources of information that may not be reflected in the official documents. So I like this image of blind people and an elephant, that old story about wherever a person touches, a phenomena reflects their understanding of it. And when we do fatality reviews, we have people from all different professions participating in the review, and their particular angle of vision, what they've dealt with, what their mission is, will determine what they understand about that relationship and about that homicide. And the point of bringing a review team together is to bring all those different perspectives so that we see the whole elephant, or we see the whole picture of the people's lives. And we can only really tap into that when we also add interviews with survivors. So once your team decides that you're going to conduct some collateral interviews as part of your review, make sure that the team prepares for that. And so there's a lot of things that you should be doing before you begin to engage in a collateral interview. Get the team to identify what it is they want to know, rather than just say, well, let's just talk to the parents, or let's just talk to the siblings. Why are you doing that? What is it that you want to learn from that interview? Make sure that the team has already reviewed whatever documents are available to the team, so that they're familiar, very familiar with the documents and the history of the relationship as recorded in those documents, and identify what information in those documents is public, what's private and what's confidential, because you don't want to violate anybody's confidentiality in the course of conducting an interview. So make sure the team is clear about that. Develop a list of people who were involved with both the perpetrator and the victim, or a character list, and then determine which of those individuals would be valuable to participate in a collateral interview. From the team, you may have a lot of people who would like to participate in the interviews. Make sure that the people who participate are the appropriate individuals to do so. So you'll often have team members who are skilled social workers or advocates on your team, perhaps detectives who are used to doing sensitive interviews. These are not forensic interviews. They're not designed to gather evidence for a criminal prosecution. They're designed to develop empathy and rapport with the people who are being interviewed and gain an understanding. So that's a very different skill set, and you want to ensure that the most appropriate individuals on your team get that assignment. You'll be talking about very difficult topics, sensitive information, and so you want to think about how you're going to record that information. Some people like to have a tape recorder going during the interview so that they don't have to be bothered taking notes, but some individuals are not comfortable with a tape recording, and in those cases you might want to just take a pad and jot down some notes. If there are two people at the interview, one person can be typing on a computer while the other person maintains eye contact with the person being interviewed. Other times you might just want to talk without any recording device, and then after you leave the interview, speak into a tape recorder or take notes. And if there's more than one person doing the interview, you can debrief together and make sure that you both understand what was said in the interview. But decide on what you're going to do before getting there. And then in terms of arranging the contact with the people that you want to interview, use existing relationships. And typically that will be your victim advocates on the team who've already made contact, particularly with the victim's family, and potentially with other organizations in the community. It's really important that first contact be with someone that is sensitive and that the family feels comfortable with and can trust. So there's different ways you can approach the collateral interviews. Some people want to come to the team meeting. They feel that they'd like to address the whole team. And if that's the case, you want to prepare the team and make sure that they're all aware of courtesy and respect. So we don't want people checking their Facebook while a victim's family is talking about their loss. And the kinds of questions that you want to ask have to be sure that you're not blaming the victim or blaming the family in the course of this interview. But there's a lot of people that don't feel comfortable speaking in front of a large group, and so another way to do it is to appoint people to conduct interviews at the convenience of the interviewees. And our team has done interviews in people's homes or at a restaurant, or sometimes just over the telephone if there's a distance barrier. You have to make sure that wherever that interview is taking place, there's enough privacy and safety for everyone involved. You can also interview perpetrators who are incarcerated. That we'll talk a little bit about how you can access perpetrators and gain entry to a prison to do an interview. Or another method, if the people are not really available to talk, is to send written questions and have the person respond in writing to those questions. We've done that with incarcerated perpetrators who are in another state, and it's just not practical to get to them. So as I mentioned, you really need to be familiar with the case before you go in there. So people, especially family members, really would expect that you are quite familiar with what happened to their loved one. And then the kinds of questions you'll be asking will be influenced by your knowledge of the case. Where are the gaps in the story? What aspects of the person's life might be most relevant for understanding what happened to them? So develop a list of questions. Ask the other team members to contribute questions. You'll have a lot of documentary evidence prior to doing the interview, and you may hear something that is inconsistent with that documentary evidence, and you don't want to be challenging a person, but it's helpful to have that awareness as a person's talking. They tell you that the homicide, if a perpetrator is in prison and they tell you the homicide was actually a suicide, you will have the knowledge that that was proven not to be the case, but it can inform the way that you'll take in the information that that person is providing to you. Whoops, excuse me. So again, like every other kind of aspect of a review, you want to ensure that all appellate issues have been concluded. I know that there's at least one state, California, that permits review of cases where this isn't the case, but it's still best practice to ensure that those issues have been concluded so that there's no contamination, I guess, of the kinds of things people are going to tell you or feel able to tell you. Explain if you're doing an interview with a perpetrator or even a perpetrator's loved ones that you have no legal influence and you won't be able to influence early release decisions or conditions of release or obtaining privileges. Sometimes perpetrators who are incarcerated don't fully understand that this is just something they're participating in to help the community and it won't help their case. So make sure they understand that. And also that they understand that if they reveal information about other offenses and particularly about abuse of a child, that has to be reported and that the mandate to report is in place for the people doing the interview. And then also determine if there are any civil issues pending, if there's a lawsuit against a police department or anybody else that might be jeopardized by information that comes out. So you want to try to make sure that those issues have all been resolved.
So I'm going to say a few words to follow on from what Dr. Ferraro has already mentioned. And I want to kick off by talking about outreach to perpetrators, which I've done a lot, and as Dr. Ferraro has done a lot over the years. I was at a prison in one of the western states, I don't know, 10 years ago, and I turned up with my tape recorder and my notes in my briefcase and parked my car in the parking lot of the prison. I had a letter from the warden who'd agreed to let me chat with a gentleman who'd killed his family and buried them in the desert. And so I turned up and showed the the guard at the initial entry point. This was a maximum security prison. That I had this letter, that I had my tape recorder in my bag. This was in the day of tape recorders, before we had cell phones that did that well. And the guard said to me, unfortunately, you're not going to take that tape recorder in. And I said, well, actually, I have a letter from the warden. And the guard looked at me as sort of an uptight British academic and said, I don't care what the warden told you. The warden's not here today. You can take your letter. And he suggested what I do with the letter. And, I didn't really appreciate that, but I realized that I was up against it here. So I had to take my tape recorder and pretty much everything else back to my car and sit for 4 hours with this gentleman while he told me the story of his life without notes. So accessing is not as easy as it sounds. And as Dr. Ferraro has said, using all the connections in the world that we have doesn't necessarily guarantee you that on the day you're going to get what you want. It's really important with perpetrators, and I've had some successes reaching out to perpetrators in fatality reviews. In other cases, they've denied me access, either through their counsel, or they've just said flat out, no, we don't want to replay the state's case. And, even if you reassure the perpetrator that that's not your interest in replaying the state's case, it's hard to get that point across sometimes. So explaining purpose is very important. Explaining that maybe that if you're interviewing family members, or you're interviewing perpetrators, that this in itself may be helpful to surviving family or other family members. Sometimes this is helpful, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But locating offenders in correctional facilities using sort of standard inmate locators is obviously one way of doing it. But asking team members who are connected, folks who have connections with the corrections system, maybe even a representative from the Department of Corrections that serves on a team, for example, might be very helpful. And there are states that have those representatives that can be extremely helpful when it comes to ironing out any difficulties with regard to access. So obviously there are rules of dress, there are rules of behavior entering prison facilities. One needs to know what they are, one needs to adhere to them. I don't wear my jewelry when I go into these places. I try to cut down on my various adornments. But having plan B is really important. And it's easy to get spooked by prison authorities sometimes. So having plan B in place is valuable. So what are we doing when we go in? What do I think about when I go in and do these interviews? I have some things in the back of my mind. I obviously want to do what I would refer to as a life history interview. I don't want to focus on necessarily the killing event. If the offender wants to go there, if we're in a prison setting, then I want to look at that through their eyes, but that's not my prime focus. The prime focus is to do a life history interview. I'm interested in the life of the person. I'm interested in things like the trauma that they've experienced, which is a very common theme in the lives of those offenders, especially the serious trauma, what some people refer to as type 3 trauma, the polyvictimization. I'm interested in the role of gender. Reviewers are interested in the role of gender, male and female perpetrators, how that differs. That differs a little bit sometimes. And Dr. Ferraro and I will talk about some of those things. And we're interested in psychological and emotional development. So these are some of the contextual frames. There are others. How was the perpetrator compromised as they grew up? What were they afraid of? Do they have high sensitivity to threat? Do they see the world as a threatening place? I mean, many of us see the world sometimes in fearful terms, and that's understandable. We have to remember that these aspects of the lives of perpetrators are going to shape the way that they interact with us as interviewers. So what we get from the interview is not a product of the questions that we ask necessarily. It's much more than that. It's a product of the emotional exchange between the interviewer and the interviewee, how we do that interview, maybe the first initial contact, the human exchange. It's about being present. So thinking about what we want to ask, the important topics are important. So the trauma stuff is one piece of this, and I know we're living at the moment in the midst of this sort of trauma revolution, but we all have traumas in our lives of various kinds. The less severe kinds maybe a single event, something in childhood. If you're more than 3 years old, you may retain the memory. This obviously is significant, and one doesn't want to downplay it, but it's something that folks often get over. More severe, we're talking about repeated exposure to extreme external events. For example, some kind of sexual assault. And usually then, with the more extreme kinds, with repeated exposures, the memory retains that in some way. Whether the memory retains it in a way that it's easy to retrieve it and share it with a fatality reviewer is another matter. But so the more severe the trauma, we're looking here at multiple pervasive events, often beginning at a very early age and lasting for a long time. So intensity and duration, maybe even sadistic abuse, these things have the most serious psychological consequences. And often when we're dealing with an incarcerated population, we're dealing with this intense kind of trauma. And of course, the domestic violence movement has done well to focus on the psychological trauma, but it's tended to do that more with female victims of, say, domestic violence who have themselves offended. And when they're in a correctional facility, or even when they're being defended in, say, a capital trial, we want to reveal that information, but we're less likely to do that with, say, male offenders who are incarcerated. But it's important to have the trauma-informed approach across the board when we're doing fatality review work. So the psychological trauma often causes intense fear, horror, and it overwhelms our normal coping mechanisms, our defense mechanisms, and that's important. So that sense of being overwhelmed may be reinvoked through the exchange with the fatality reviewer. So it's important to bear that in mind. So that will affect the yield from the interview, and we have to be careful to be cognizant of that. So again, just to reiterate, the more severe forms of trauma, the child will be a victim often of multiple perpetrators, may have been one or more close relatives. Often the abuse is frequent and often unpredictable. And you can see here these, if force is used, if there's an element of sadism in there, they may present with suicidal tendencies, with a hopelessness. They may not be consciously aware of these things, but these are very deep things that affect one's psychic being in the world and one's ability to trust others and bond and be an integrated member of communities and engage in pro-social behavior. So these are elements that will put walls up in interviews, and interviewers need to be aware of those things. So structuring your questions and your approach around some of these issues and being aware of some of these issues is very important. So if the offender, for example, is hypervigilant, you may know why. If the offender tends to dissociate, and Dr. Ferraro and I have both been present in interviews where offenders have dissociated during interviews, you're going to see a sense of acute, extreme detachment, maybe other bodily signs of physiological change. So be prepared for that, to see that. And again, offenders are going to have high abandonment anxiety, a very strong sense of being rejected. So all these things may come out. So when shaping the interview, one needs to think about, how are we going to do this? Are we going to do this in a structured way by asking the questions, rote style, that the team deems to be important? Say questions 1 through 20, and we're going to go through like an automaton? Or are we going to do this in a sort of a semi-structured way where we have some key questions in our heads about issues that we might want to glean if the cues are presented during the life history interview? If that's something that we have, we might want to memorize those things or keep them on a keywords card to do what we would call a focused interview. Or alternatively, do we know the case so well and the materials so well, obviously not adequately, but well enough from the documentary evidence, that we can engage in that life history interview and use that wealth of knowledge that we have from our preparation that enables us to cue in almost automatically on the things that we want. So these, whether the interview's structured, semi-structured, or focused, or unstructured, almost free conversation, these are things to think about before we go in to the interview exchange. So again, we may be expecting to see, and this is taken from the work of Solomon and Heidi, which was published in 1999, PTSD symptoms, denial, repression, all these different things that I've listed that I won't just read out. But we're going to see a lot of this stuff in these interviews. We should expect it, be prepared for it. Some people are comfortable with this, some people aren't. Gauging your comfort level is important. I know interviewers who can do this, who are just superb, that are sort of mentors for me. I know a detective down in southern Arizona who does this magically. I've met victim advocates who can do this in the same way, who seem to be able to be present and unperturbed. The issues of polyvictimization are other things that we ought to be aware of. I don't think we need to dwell on this, but often folks in prison have dealt with multiple people in their lives who have abused them. And significantly, about 10% of them have suffered 7 or more types of victimization. This is heavy stuff. And we have to remember that if we're dealing with perpetrators of intimate partner homicide, which we are often when we do things like prison interviews, we're dealing with a specialist subset of offenders, of which probably 15 to 20% of them are going to exhibit signs of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. So the issues that we have around interviewing may be further compounded with that psychopathy or sociopathy. So again, thinking about that, maybe preparing around that might be somewhat helpful. So we want to explore the psychic development of individuals and some of their aspects of their emotional demeanor, basically. We also want to know some things that may be helpful for us in sort of a gross, sort of morphological sense. Have they experienced head injuries? I mean, this is something that I personally have come across a number of times in interviews where, as the life history is unfolding, folks will talk about serious head injuries. I interviewed 3 men, I don't know, between 5 and 10 years ago, one of whom told me he was kicked in the head by a horse and knocked unconscious for a period of time. Another who was beaten by a 2x4 by his father, and the only memory he had was being carried away in the ambulance and looking down on his legs, with his legs and his feet twitching from the extent of the injury. I remember talking with a woman who had almost been murdered by a gentleman who had experienced in his earlier life a car crash where he'd been thrown through the windshield and ended up in a coma for 2 or 3 days. So these head injuries, these morphological injuries, are things that may cue us in to PTSD symptoms, other things that matter.
So I think to go off script just a tiny bit here, what Dr. Websdale's been talking about is having the capacity to sit with a perpetrator and be non-judgmental. You will know of the offense they committed, and one part of you will be disgusted by that behavior. But in the interview, you're taking the role of an empathetic, good listener. So a key to that is trying to leave your judgments outside and try to deal with this person on a one-to-one human level, not as the perpetrator that you've learned about prior to meeting them. So Dr. Websdale's talked a lot about the psychological components that are prevalent in the perpetrators that we meet. But I want to talk about the social context, which sometimes gets overlooked when we talk about homicide and domestic violence more generally. So we know that a lot of people, most people, 2/3 of people in the United States score at least 1 on the ACEs scale. So at most 2/3 of people in the United States have experienced at least one of these adverse childhood experiences. But they have they haven't had a lasting impact on their psyche, partly because of the protective factors in their environment that supported them. And if a person is experiencing adverse childhood experiences in the context of poverty and economic inequality, the possibility of those experiences resulting in negative outcomes is much greater, of course. And so in interacting with the perpetrator, you don't only want to know about their head injuries and their individual traumas, but what was the context of their childhood and their adolescence and their early adult years. Did they grow up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of violence, a lot of drug dealing, a lot of single parents who are on the edges of economic stability, so hunger, school dropouts. So these individuals often will have very high ACEs scores, and they'll be in the small percentage of people that have 5 or more ACEs. And so it's not just their individual adverse experiences, it's the adverse experience of the entire community in which they lived. So it's important to try to gain from them, what was it like in your neighborhood? What kind, as Dr. Websdale said, what things threatened you there? We know that from Dr. Kachawi's research on health and social inequality, that homicide rates parallel levels of social inequality. So comparing states that have high levels of social inequality, meaning the gap between the wealthy and the poor, they also have the highest homicide rates in the country. And it's a very powerful explanatory variable, meaning that we can understand a lot about homicide in communities, not just from individual factors, but from the nature of the society that they're surviving in. And for many people, it is their neighborhoods are a context of survival of the fittest. So not only is there a high level of inequality, but there's also a low level of social capital. And what we mean by social capital is the kind of bonds in a community that make people feel connected to one another. And measurements of social capital include things like asking people, do you trust people? Are most people kind and good and looking out for one another? Or are most people out for themselves and they'll hurt you if they get a chance? People with low social capital tend to view others in their community as threats rather than as good neighbors, as Mr. Rogers would say. So that their environment is one of high levels of threat and lack of trust and lack of sense of being able to turn to someone in your neighborhood for assistance when you have problems. And also a low level of trust in the system that we've designed to protect people, especially victims of domestic violence. And so we'll also, of course, look for individual factors like, what was their relationship with their parent, and some of these issues are not tapped into directly by ACEs. So you can have a parent who is absent not because they've abandoned the family, but because they have limited cognitive ability to parent. They may have a parent who is mentally ill or a substance abuser. That is going to affect their sense of security and their place in the world. Are their parents undocumented? Of course, we live in a state with a border that a lot of people are quite concerned about their immigration status and feel very vulnerable and uncomfortable turning to the criminal justice system for protection, for example. And some communities really don't feel positive about turning to help for mental health issues. We've reviewed cases where families said, yeah, we knew there was something different about this child from the time they were young, but in our community, you just shape up or ship out and you don't rely on therapists to get into your family business. So there are different cultural barriers that you want to explore to try to understand the entire social context of what a perpetrator grew up with.
So James Garbarino puts it rather nicely, and I'm going to talk a little bit about male perpetrators and then Dr. Ferraro is going to talk from her experience with female perpetrators, but Garbarino puts it like this: most male killers are best understood as untreated, traumatized children who inhabit and control the minds, hearts, and bodies of adult men. And Garbarino's done some great work. He wrote a book called Listening to Killers, which he published in 2015, University of California Press. And, you know, regardless of your politics, I mean, we're not talking here as sort of folks who say, oh, poor perpetrator, you know, our hearts go out to you. What we're talking about is how to get information about the case and how to better understand the situation. So acknowledging this at the front end is important. The domestic violence movement has really been imbued with this sense that male perpetrators are sort of have this desire for power and dominance and control, and they situate this violence within this context of the overall oppression of women in a patriarchal society. And this is one of the standard arguments in the field, but one of the problems with this is that we often miss, it doesn't really go far enough in some ways, because we often miss the way in which these guys feel very powerless sometimes, very vulnerable, very dependent. It also implies or infers that there's some kind of conscious plot here going on, or that they have a certain level of intent, which may be of interest to the criminal justice system for the prosecution, but for death review, which is not an investigation, it's not a forensic analysis, it's an attempt to understand. We don't need to be inferring those things. We need to try to make sense of the life of these folks and then piece that stuff together to see whether that inference is actually sensible or not. So we've got this paradox of the power and the powerlessness at the same time. So rendering these concepts that we have in the movement, particularly regarding, say, control, as problematic, it's helpful to bear that in mind as we go into these interviews. I think we also have to acknowledge sometimes that there may be unconscious drives and things that we just simply cannot understand about these cases. I mean, we've both had folks who've killed and committed serious acts of violence speak to us about that in ways that don't fit into neat boxes. And the purpose of doing good review is to listen and to try to get a sense of what the perpetrator is telling us, to be present, and then to convey that information back to the team, not to filter it or to censor it through our own filtering mechanisms as individuals or as researchers or whatever, but just to simply report what we've heard. So this sensitivity to rejection that perpetrators have had, I've always thought this was very, very important to remember as we go into these interviews. On the one hand, they're in a prison setting and they may present with great bluster or even aggression, or even in a threatening manner. Sometimes they may not, it just depends. But underneath that, often we see other things, a vulnerability, a sense of abandonment, etc. So being aware of that is important. Also, you know, we don't want to miss the fact, as James Gilligan has pointed out, that the aggression that folks have, both maybe in their lives, in their relationships, in their communities, or even in prison where we may be interviewing them, is maybe a mechanism for them to prevent their own psychic annihilation. And Gilligan's work on this is really interesting and instructive and well worth a read for folks who are going to go into prison. You can Google him, you can YouTube him, or you can read the book, Violence. So anyway, well worth a read. Garbarino talks about the sort of war zone mentality that some people grow up with. And it's understandable that they will have a paranoia. And in fact, in many ways, it's a normal reaction to their circumstances. If they live, for example, in zones of concentrated poverty, where you can't walk around easily. So, you know, these are very important contextual frames. And Dr. Ferraro is now going to talk a little bit about female perpetrators and her experiences.
Right, thanks. So I think this quote from Beth Ritchie kind of encapsulates, if I could say the word, what women in prison typically face, which is that they're confined by social conditions in their communities, restrained by their family circumstances, limited by abuse in their intimate relationships, and forced to make hard choices with very few options. And Dr. Ritchie was referring to female inmates in general, but we also see this situation with regard to women who kill their intimate partners. So I think there's been a lot of recognition over the last 30 years, thanks to the work of a lot of people, to realize that typically when women kill their intimate partner, there's a history of prior abuse by that victim. And we don't have a national study that would look at all of the female homicide perpetrators across the United States to have a nice, neat statistic that could give you the correct proportion, but we have studies of localized populations, and they find anywhere from 70 to 83% of the cases that they look at involve a history of abuse by the victim of a woman who commits intimate partner homicide. And way back in the 1950s, the famous criminologist Wolfgang said, women are twice as likely as men to commit victim-precipitated homicide. He called it, just meaning that the homicide wasn't to gain an advantage or out of revenge or just cold blood, but it was out of a response to some threatening behavior on the part of the victim. But we also know, even if you go up to 83%, that not every female perpetrator of intimate partner homicide is acting in self-defense. Certainly there are cases where there's been no prior abuse in the relationship. But there are also cases where we know there's been prior abuse, but the homicide itself was not an act of defensive behavior. And we know that the statutes now in most states, I think in all states, include awareness of the different perceptions of a victim who's had prior acts of domestic violence committed, a perpetrator who's had prior acts of violence committed by the victim has a different perception of levels of danger and therefore need to act in self-defense than a person who's committing homicide against a stranger or someone not an intimate partner who's abused them. So that we are aware of the different perceptions of a person who's been abused and then kills their partner. However, there's also a need to recognize situations where there may be prior abuse, but that's not how the homicide occurs. So we have situations where both people have been violent toward each other, bidirectional violence, and I do understand that that's a controversial topic in the movement, but it's pretty clear from our fatality review work, as well as a lot of social science, that there are instances in which both partners are violent against the other. There are homicides that occur as a result of escalating financial problems that the perpetrator feels threaten their own existence, that if something isn't done, the partner will enact violence against them because of the financial problems they're in. There are certainly revenge murders, typically a response to jealousy, or some other very egregious action on the part of an intimate partner. I've worked with cases where a woman shot her husband because she fully believed that person was molesting their daughter. Never was verified, but it was more of an action of revenge. Another woman who shot her husband because he had shot her father, so she was getting revenge against him. Often a new man has come on the picture, typically a man and possibly a woman. We've never seen a case like that, certainly a possibility. A new partner at any rate, who suggests that the old partner needs to disappear in order for this new relationship to blossom. And so even though there may have been violence by the person in the past, the victim, it's the new partner and the desire for a new start that is the catalyst for homicide. And sometimes these new partners will suggest that they commit the homicide. And then the woman is prosecuted for her role in a third-party homicide. And then, of course, there are situations where there's serious mental illness and perception of danger and threat from someone who is not actually dangerous as a result of hallucinations, paranoid delusions about the threat that a person may experience. So we can't assume that a woman who has committed intimate partner homicide was only acting in self-defense, or that her homicide was the result of prior abuse by her partner. And of course, there are also instances of female perpetrated intimate partner homicide where there was no prior abuse. She may not even claim that there was prior abuse, but her actions may be the consequence of a lifetime of polyvictimization. As Dr. Websdale said earlier, a lot of these perpetrators have multiple incidents of victimization throughout their lives by multiple perpetrators. So this person may not have abused them, but that history of abuse is really important to understanding what led up to the incident homicide that you're there to talk about. So what do you want to talk to them about? Well, find out how is it that they met this person? What's the history of the romantic relationship between the person you're interviewing and the deceased? What was that relationship like in the beginning? What drew them into that? And a lot of times, in my experience anyway, when I'm interviewing a person who's been abused, they will think that's all that they need to talk about. But always there's something very positive in that relationship that drew them into it and that kept them in it. And so find out what those things were. Did they have children? Did they have children prior to becoming involved with this person? Did they have children with this person? And if so, how did that affect their relationship? If there were kids from a prior relationship, how did that affect the relationship with their partner? These are things that we know have high correlation with intimate partner homicide, and you want to try to find out as much about those relationships as you can. I just popped forward a long way. We know that there are often changes in the relationship that are the catalyst for a homicide, and often that's one person pulling away from the other, and that may be in the form of having an affair with another person, or the one person decides that they are done with that relationship and they want to leave. As I mentioned, growing financial problems that just throw both people into despair. Are there problems accelerating? So maybe one person has just lost their job, one person has just gone back to using a drug that they had kicked earlier. Was their partner's behavior increasing in severe aggression? Are they increasing their use of violence? And were they high or intoxicated at the time of the homicide? Sometimes a person will be so stoned, drunk out of it, that they have very little recollection of what occurred in the homicide. And that's just something that you will encounter, and there's not much you can do about it, but you want to find out what their state of mind was at the time of the homicide.
So I now want to turn to a couple of other issues and move this in a little bit of a different direction, to discuss just a little bit about memory. And if we look at the literature on memory impairment with violent offenders, anywhere from 1/4 to 4/10 of them, are going to claim some kind of amnesia or forgetting, if I can put it that way. And as Gilligan has written on this, one can never know for certain what's going on or has gone on in another person's mind. And of course, it's very hard to know. I mean, we all lead secret lives. At some level, we all have things we don't want people to know about. So this is also true for violent offenders. There'll be things that they don't want to share. I mean, these are the reasons we have really intense confidentiality and privacy laws in the United States, because we have this very high level of insularity and, you know, protection of the individual and the self. So these are big issues. So the question for us as fatality reviewers is basically, are these people playing games with us? Are they genuinely amnesic? What else is going on? So there may be a number of things here. The word malingering is used, or faking, in the research literature. And there are a number of possibilities. They may want to reduce their responsibility or their guilt. For example, I interviewed a guy in a prison, and again, I won't name the state, who he had basically executed his wife. The forensic evidence was very clear that he'd put the gun to her forehead and shot her in the head and killed her. He maintained throughout the interview with me and one other team member that she had been the aggressor. And we had all read the forensic evidence, the crime scene stuff. We'd listened to the fabricated 9/11 call, the dispatch call that this gentleman had made after the homicide, some time after the homicide, might say. And we knew that this was basically bogus, but there was a motive maybe to reduce responsibility, to reduce his sense of guilt. Maybe the amnesia provides a reason not to discuss the crime. People are ashamed or embarrassed by what they've done. These tendencies of faking it are more common for sort of violent and sexual crimes, as opposed to other forms of criminality. Often that faking or malingering is associated with lower IQs or personality disorders, or some kind of poorer executive functioning. So there may be some kind of organic impairment there too. That's possible, and that's difficult. The gentleman the example I used, had himself experienced severe head injury in a fight with his father, and he was also a raging alcoholic. Not at the time of the interview. He'd been, I think, sober in prison for a year or so. But these are things that obviously interfere with our interpretation. There are what's called malingering scales that you can use if you wanted to even check this out, although even they aren't necessarily that reliable. So these tendencies are also associated with recidivism. Obviously here ultimately we're talking about denial of responsibility for one's behavior. But we need to remember that there's an ongoing debate about the prevalence of genuine amnesia. However, having said that, amnesia is an issue. And I want to refer here just briefly to the work of Evans et al., which was published in 2007, and they conducted semi-structured interviews or focused interviews with 105 young offenders who were convicted of serious violence. And what they did was they assessed those offenders for what they called intrusive memories and ruminations, endless sort of ruminating or reflection upon the action that they had engaged in, to the point of it being very distressing for them and stressful for them. And they also looked at PTSD levels as well, related to the violent actions. And almost half of those offenders described significant intrusive memories. And we'll notice here, obviously, this is, akin to the phenomenon of flashbacks that we see with victims in intimate partner violence cases. So there's a certain irony to this, if we can put it that way. Over a third of them reported these ruminations as well. And this obviously goes along with the kind of extreme anxiety that some of these offenders also feel, this sort of repetitive apprehensiveness that they have in their lives, perhaps that predated the violence as well. So the similarity between the trauma here for the perpetrator and even trauma victims is marked, and something we should look closely at. It may be involuntarily triggered, and it may create high distress. And this is something to remember in the interview, that triggering those things. So this is why it's very important. We don't have the luxury in fatality review interviews of doing sort of some kind of, psychological or counseling intervention where it's phased, in hour or 50-minute blocks that are paid for by our insurance companies. I mean, these are one-off interviews often in prison that may last 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 hours. I mean, I know people who've done 10-hour interviews in fatality reviews. So we don't have a chance. In some ways, all of this stuff comes out, if it's going to come out, in one sitting. So this may not be the best for, traumatic, resolution of trauma over time or healing. That's why it's very important to pace and set the interview using the perpetrator or the interviewee as the person who's in control of that. That's why the life history interview, the open-ended approach, is much more conducive to the more regulated resolution of these traumatic disclosures within the interview setting. So we know that ruminations are frequently triggered by intrusive memories, and it's almost like a cyclical relationship between these things. They vary in length and severity, but they're clearly linked to PTSD. So we're in dangerous territory sometimes when we go to these things. And, we have to be thoughtful about how we handle that. So interviewers potentially re-traumatizing offenders is something to think about, just as it is when we're interviewing family members. So these are tricky issues. The act of killing, and this is going to sound at best ironic and at worst politically incorrect, but the act of killing a family member is itself traumatic. So while it's obviously ultimately traumatic, terminally traumatic for the victim, the decedent, it is also traumatic for most of these perpetrators. So half of convicted killers, roughly half at least, meet the criteria for PTSD for the offense related to the reason you're there or other lifetime trauma. So again, we've mentioned this before, and I don't want to dwell on this, but we're gonna see great sensitivity to rejection on the part of these offenders, whether it be from their communities early on, from the lack of pro-social behavior in their communities, in their families, in prison, in their relationships. So exploring issues of parental abandonment, allowing offenders to go there in their earlier lives themselves, to take you there, whether they were bullied or ridiculed, whether they suffered serious losses, parental losses, death of a parent. These are all things that hopefully will increase our understanding that we want to unfold over time. And it's quite remarkable what offenders will reveal if you can be present. And be present with a filter that says, we need to think carefully about what this might mean, because we have to recontextualize this, resituate it in the light of the teamwork that we have. So we are also going to see on the part of the offender a lot of paranoia. And obviously paranoia is not a comfortable place to be. So it's going to be linked to their history of abuse and traumatization. So they're going to be suspicious as well. And they're going to be suspicious of interviewers, and so they should be. So they'll see threats where others don't see threats. That may actually be linked even to their act of homicide. So again, it's important that the interview is non-threatening. So those aspects of the offender's biography, whether they imagine someone was having an affair, whatever their beliefs were, whether she was planning to leave him or vice versa, whether he believed she was colluding with others to harm him, etc. All of these things may appear ridiculous, but to the offender, i.e. the interviewee, they may be real in their effects. So even if what offenders tell you out of what appears to be a base of paranoia doesn't fit with the documentary record, doesn't mean it isn't meaningful to the offender and should not be meaningful to the team in its interpretations of the offender's behavior. This is very important takeaway from fatality review, because it affects the safety planning that we operationalize in the field when we're trying to anticipate the often secretive, furtive behavior of offenders themselves, which can be very calculating and very devious. So these are things that we want to learn. I'm now going to pass this on to Dr. Ferraro.
Yeah, I was going to say too, it's always interesting if one of your main sources of information about a homicide are a newspaper reports, in cases particularly where there hasn't been a lot of prior contact between people and the police or other agencies. You will be amazed at the difference in your perception of the homicide once you do these collateral interviews, not only with the perpetrator but with others that we're going to talk about in a minute, compared to how the media portrays the homicide. It's usually so much more complicated than the way the media presents a homicide, and it's partly because they don't have access to all the information. But it's, again, very important to get this other perspectives. So one thing we want to gather when we're doing these interviews is, what does the perpetrator think could have prevented the homicide? And so what are their recommendations? And so you can ask them, what obstacles confronted you that you felt unable to surmount? What were the major things? And who could have done a better job in helping you with that? And what would have helped? And sometimes they don't know. They take all the blame themselves. Other times they may blame people inappropriately, as Dr. Websdale's last slide showed. They can blame their mom. But we want to know what they think and what they think could have helped them. And what would they tell somebody else who is struggling with a tough relationship issue? What advice would they give? And you can get some great kernels of wisdom from asking these questions. And we want to talk too about interviewing survivors of near death or near lethal assaults. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of states permit teams to conduct these reviews, and they're a tremendous source of information, obviously, because you have a living victim who can tell you themselves what their situation was. So a lot of times the dynamics in these fatalities are the same. Near fatalities are the same as fatalities, and what differentiates them is the medical intervention. So it could have resulted in a death, but due to medical intervention, it did not, fortunately. Or the choice of weapon. Sometimes if a less lethal form of weapon is used, a bat or a knife, possibly that person will survive, but the situation will be very similar in other regards to a fatality. So they can provide these critical details about what happened that are not available through other sources. You still have to be sure that the case is resolved. There's no appellate or civil actions pending, but it allows the perception of what resources were available to them prior to the near lethal attack, and if they didn't use them, why not? And if they did use them, what was good, what was problematic, and what improvements would they suggest? So we want to turn also to other kinds of collateral interviews that are very helpful, and first of all, other family members that survive the homicide victim. And in the British Pemberton report, which was the kickoff report in England that started their fatality review initiative, they were very forceful in saying that family members want and need to be involved at the earliest opportunity and at all stages of the process of fatality review, that a review should not be conducted without the involvement of family members. So one thing we know is that in a significant number of cases that teams review, there hasn't been much prior contact with agencies, and so you won't be able to get information from those sources, from police departments or from domestic violence shelters are rarely used by victims prior to homicides. And so it was, we know from across the country that there's very few cases we review where there's been an active involvement with agencies protecting a battered woman and then she was killed regardless of those efforts. It's an unusual situation where that occurs. And we also found that the research that was published was documenting that the people closest to the decedents knew the most about them. And they were the ones who could fill in the gaps in our documentary evidence. And also surviving family members began to agitate for being involved, and finding out that reviews were taking place without their involvement was not only offensive but hurtful, and led to the need, recognition of the need to bring those family members to the table and get their input on the review. Now, that doesn't mean that every family member wants to participate in a fatality review. There are certainly instances where family members do not want to talk to anybody about it. They've either put it behind them or it's just too painful for them to talk about it to people. And of course, that has to be respected. But a lot of family members do want to contribute. And when they do, they often say that it's been cathartic and meaningful because many people want to participate as a way of giving meaning to the death of their loved one and to help other families not suffer the same tragedy that they've gone through. But when you do involve family members, it's important that you explain the limits of their involvement. They're not members of the team. They're there to assist the team. And so there's confidentiality regulations that limit what you can share with them. And then there may also be family members of the perpetrator who would like to be involved. And you can learn a lot from talking to the family of the perpetrator. The Montana Death Review team, for example, brought the stepmother of a perpetrator to the table. She'd been demonized in the media for spawning a monster, and she agreed to be interviewed. She spoke for 4 hours and really assisted in learning about what came before that particular homicide, the Mosier case, which is described in the film that's on our website of the Montana review team from 2005. So if you'd like to hear her speak, she is interviewed in that film that's available on the website. You have to remember that every survivor of an intimate partner homicide is different, and so that includes the kids, the parents, the siblings, and the friends and extended relatives. Be ready to listen to what they have to say. As Dr. Websdale said in regard to perpetrators, this is true with any collateral interview that you're conducting. And sometimes you might wonder what a topic has to do with the homicide. So it's your job to be attentive and listen to what it is they want to share, and not filter out, let them decide what's important for you to know. How a survivor had been notified of the death of their loved one kind of sets the tone for their future encounters with people that they perceive as connected to the system. So even though fatality review team members may not be part of the prosecutor's office or the police department, you'll be connected with those because of your role as an official kind of entity in the community. And so if they had a very negative experience in their notification or following that, then you need to be aware of that because that's going to color the way they perceive you coming in and talking to them. The initial contact with survivors should be done very delicately, as I mentioned earlier, as selecting someone from the team who has a relationship is ideal. If you have a victim advocate on the team who's worked with the family through the court process, they're the ideal person to make that initial contact. And of course, they don't want to feel that you are intentionally hiding things from them, keeping things from them. You have to explain the limits of your ability to share information that's not public, but certainly any public information needs to be discussed openly with that family member. So things that you might kind of lead the interview on is to try to find out what the relationship was with the person at the time of the homicide. So if it's parents, did that adult child move away from the family? Did they become more isolated? Or were they seeking out closer relationship with the family at the time and that was threatening to the perpetrator? What's the media coverage? Is the media portraying the victim as partly to blame for their own demise? Have the police insinuated that in any way? That needs to be aired and discussed because we want to try to reassure them that that's not the case. In some instances, the family may feel that they're being blamed, the family of the victim, that they didn't do enough. We certainly have interviewed family members that felt that there was some element in that in the public discussion of the homicide, that the family didn't do enough to protect their adult child. A sensitive interviewer should potentially interview, if possible, each family member by themselves, so that there's not any sense of needing to hide things from another person in the family and be discreet with that. And then bring the information that's shareable back to the survivors. They would like to know what the team learned and what the team is going to recommend. So we typically share the annual reports that don't contain any private confidential information with the family, so they know what the team is recommending. And of course, the philosophy of fatality review is no blame, no shame, and obviously never suggests that any person, any survivor bears blame for the homicide. They may share with you a sense of that. They should have known, they should have done something differently, and to reassure them that no one's blaming them. We often get requests for sample letters that you can be sent to families. We're requesting their participation, and we do have letters on our website that you can use, but it's really important that the family not perceive this as kind of a bureaucratic form letter that they're receiving. They want a human contact, a person to reach out to them. It's best if it's possible to make that contact through a phone call. If you have to do it through a letter, a personal letter is much more effective than using a stock letter that you get off the internet. And you tend to think about family members as people who have kind of had their lives destroyed, that you want to be very, very sensitive with, that they're delicate and fragile. And this is a quote from Shirley Pierce Boston, who lost her daughter to an intimate partner homicide, that many survivors are not weak, fragile people defeated. They are strong and courageous, with a passion to do everything they can to give meaning to their murdered loved one's life and death. And we've heard this over and over again, that these people have been through hell, and talking to a member of the Fatality Review team is not going to traumatize them. They want to participate. Clearly there are those who will say they don't want to, but for those who do, involve them. They want to be involved, and they're not going to shatter by talking to you. Other people that you might consider involving are friends, neighbors, and other agencies that might have had contact with the family that are not part of the domestic violence or criminal justice system. They can produce things that other people might not know about. Neighbors may have heard or seen things that other family members may not know. They may produce contradictory accounts. For example, they may have seen the victim harshly disciplining the child in the front yard, where it appears from the documents that only the perpetrator was an abuser. They may know things about the kids in the family that would shed light on the whole situation. Interviewing people from the schools, the churches, we had interviewed someone from a literacy program who was able to shed a lot of interesting light on the dynamics of that family situation. So sometimes you want to see if there were other agencies the family had contact with that might have details that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. And of course, you still have to abide by the same confidentiality regulations. You don't want to share something with any of these people that is private and confidential. And you can use these individuals to find others who might be helpful to the process, ask if there's anyone else they can think of that might be of benefit to the review process.
And then just before I forget, you know, at the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative, we do provide technical assistance to communities, in fact, to the 46 states that are conducting fatality reviews. And we do, for example, Skype webinars that are tailored to individual team members. So if this is a particular topic that interests your team and you're thinking about going down this path, we can set up a set Skype interview with you for a couple of hours to talk, not formally in the way that we're presenting this information, but in other ways, or have other regrouping conversations with you or whatever. So just wanted to say that before I forget. But, you know, what does a respectful interview look like? It's important, as we've said before, to explain that you've read the file and you've done your due diligence, and all team members obviously ideally do this if they have the time. They read the file, they master the information. But if you're going into an interview, you want to know that file well. But again, to say that the purpose is not to revisit the act of killing, it's a life history conversation. They can go where they like. So the goal is understanding, not just mere fact-finding. The idea is to be present. And I've always found that the interviews that I've done that have gone well have been interviews where there has been rapport established very quickly. And I think that initial interaction, especially if you're in a prison setting, and being relaxed and building rapport and being respectful is really important. That establishment of rapport is, I think the social science research says, very, very important. We're not there to judge. We've already talked about this. We express our gratitude for folks. We make good eye contact. We're attentive. We make sure, and this is rather like interviewing victims or perps in other settings too. We use empathetic listening skills. You know, we're not there to, judge them. We're there to listen to their story, to acknowledge. And listening's very, very difficult with a view to understanding. We acknowledge their losses. The perpetrator has lost someone. They've lost a lot, including their freedom often. So acknowledging that is important. So for perpetrators, tell me about yourself. Tell me about the victim. Tell me about your family members. And anticipate something that's non-linear. In other words, allow them to tell their story. You know, if you set out with a structured interview with a set number of questions, you'll come across almost robotized at times. You want to be able to have a free-flowing conversation about these issues with all these different players. So bear in mind here that we're interviewing a good number of people who will have very different perspectives. And just to give you an example of this, you know, I know the risk assessment literature and indeed industry has derived a lot of its sort of sustenance from the comparison between death groups and control groups and the use of proxy informants. And by proxy informants, these are people in cases like surviving family members, like others, who can tell us about what the victim, for example, went through or what the victim thought or perceived was going on. But what we find in fatality review work is that what we've got is a lot of what I refer to as sort of socially situated realities, different impressions of what's going on. So in one case that I did, and it's the Susie Casey case, and I can share this, it's on the public record, I personally interviewed 9 of their family members. And of those 9 family members, 8 of them said that Susie Casey, who was murdered by Marty Larson, did not think that Marty was capable of killing her. 8 out of 9 told me that from their experience with Susie. Only one of them, her mother, told me that Susie thought that Marty was capable of killing her. So what we see is, and I'm not saying this in any, sort of as any way of criticizing proxy interviews, but just to make this cautionary note that these perspectives will differ. And it's not the job of the interviewer at the interview to challenge or quiz or necessarily question, but possibly just to listen and maybe pursue gently certain leads for clarification. But it's the team's job when the information is reported later. So be patient, allow for silences. Silences are okay. And, waiting for folks to think through and process stuff is just fine. If you do drift too far afield, you may want to gently guide the discussion back. But as Dr. Ferraro said earlier, folks in these interview settings, whether they be perpetrators, whether they be survivors in near-death cases, whether they be family members, often talk in ways that may not be immediately obviously linked to the information that you want, but may nevertheless, on reflection, be extremely helpful. If people find it difficult to talk about traumatic episodes, they may talk about them through mentioning other things. So how people talk, what they talk about, how they do that is very important to pay attention to. So be careful when you're talking about people drifting far afield. It may be far afield for you, but it may not be far afield for them. There may be some kind of metaphor here that they're talking through that you may want to pay attention to. So encourage elaboration, but also encourage specificity. Oh, what does that mean? How did that look? What were the details? Tell me about that. Could you give me an example of that kind of behavior that you objected to, or this or that? Oh, she taunted me. Can you tell us about what that looked like? What was an example of that? How did that take form? And don't necessarily stop with superficial responses. I mean, you may have read, for example, a pre-sentence investigation report, which may be done very, very well, which may contain a lot of information about childhood trauma, and very sensitive information. And you may get an offender, for example, in a prison, or a surviving family member who will tell you, oh, my childhood was great. But you know that that's not what your perception is from the file. So you don't have to stop at the superficial response, but you can inquire further. Oh, what does great look like? Tell us more about your childhood. What did that look like? Who was around for that? Etc., etc. So explore some of those things. Recognize the person's telling a difficult story, their pain, their fears, their discomfort. And, let them know that it can be difficult to talk about some of these things. You can explicitly say that if you want to. You can explicitly acknowledge that it hurts to talk about some of these bad things in folks' lives, and hopefully you've laid some of that groundwork at the front end as well. But one thing I have to say from talking with offenders, I remember one offender shared with me how he was deeply ashamed of what he'd done. There were 3 of us in the interview. There was a battery intervention program specialist, a member of victim services organization, and myself. And he talked about how he was ashamed of how he'd raped his dead partner, who he'd killed through strangulation. And he'd raped her after he'd killed her, many minutes after he'd killed her, to make it look as though he'd killed her accidentally during rough sex, which of course that we knew that the autopsy information, the crime scene information didn't comport with that interpretation. But he eventually shared after being incarcerated for a while, how painful and how difficult that was for him, and how deeply ashamed he was of that. So that came out, but it came out after a long period of time. So acknowledging those difficulties. And then finally, how to conclude the interview, recognizing when the end comes, thanking folks. Obviously, you don't want to end on a traumatic note. You want to return to the reasons why you did the interview, to thank folks for their contributions. If you've been unable to take notes, you may want to go back to your vehicle or to talk into a tape recorder, as Dr. Ferraro said earlier. And it's very important that you share the interviewee's responses with the team rather than your interpretation of their responses or your seeming summary of their responses, because we want always with Fatality Review to tap the multiple and eclectic talents at the table. And if you filter through your own skill, even if it's in a well-meaning way, you limit those possibilities. So that's a very important piece of this. You may want to follow up with a phone call, with further conversations. You may want to do serial interviews potentially with family members and others. You may need to seek other information. So you still want to remain, of course, cognizant of the confidentiality guarantees. So we've now run pretty low on time. We have a couple of questions, so we'll try and do our best to answer those questions.
I think it's just a question from Rosemary Vergara about how you get into prisons, how you work with the Department of Corrections. We don't do MOUs. We typically...
We as your team?
Other teams. Yeah, teams generally. I don't know, do you do MOUs? No. I'm not aware of people doing that. Talk to the defense attorney to let them know that we want to meet with the inmate, and then contact the inmate via the prison to see if they're willing to talk to us. And if they are, then you have to work through the warden to get permission to come in and find a time that's convenient for them. So you basically have a team member. It's great if you have a law enforcement or prosecutor's office that has a relationship already with the Department of Corrections who can negotiate that.
And let me just throw in too, Rosemary, that there are some teams, the Montana team is an example, that has the director of the Department of Corrections on the team. And some teams have deliberately installed corrections representatives in order to handle this particular piece of the Fatality Review work. So they won't have formal MOUs with teams, but they will have members that enable that access or facilitate that access. Was there another question, Ray? I think we've answered this one. Are there any resources for agencies to have someone come to train the Fatality Review teams on how to conduct interviews? The answer to that is yes, we can come. Coming to a community is obviously expensive. We have people who do that. OVW support that generously, but we also do Skype interviews to set that up. And that's what I would encourage you as a point of entry to our initiative, is to give us a call, shoot us a mail, and we're good to go on that one. I don't know, Dr. Ferraro, if you have anything to add to that, but...
No, I think that covers it. As I said, if there's stuff that comes to mind that you want information on, there's our contact information. There's a ton of information on our website if you haven't visited, NDVFRI.org.
And we also have a new film up there as well. The Montana Indian Country review film is a new addition to our website, and there again